substitute for the. We're getting this one going. All right, everyone, going to pull you back together for our last panel of the day. Some nice chairs. So, as we've heard a lot about other conversations today, there's a lot of exclusions from the Animal Welfare Act and specifically entire categories of animals that are excluded. So that's what this next panel will be about. And for that, I'll turn it over to the moderator, David Casuto from Pace University Law School.
Thank you, Chris. I just have to add one little caveat because I'm supposed to, which is that Pace Law School has been renamed the Elizabeth Haub School of Law at Pace University, thanks to a generous gift from the Haub family. So I would be skewered if I didn't say that, so I'm saying it. But that's all I'm going to say, because we have three panelists who have a lot more to say than I do. And so with that, I'm just going to introduce our first speaker, Michael McFadden.
Good afternoon. I am General Counsel for Farm Forward. We are a small nonprofit working in a space that both advocates directly to consumers on farmed animal welfare issues and also works with nonprofits and institutional food buyers to help them find more humane policies that take into account the problems of factory farming. So, we've talked a lot about animals today that are not included in the Animal Welfare Act. Various estimates of mice and rats, for example, being in the hundreds of millions versus maybe only 1 or 2 million other research animals every year. But I guess maybe not elephant, maybe not gorilla, the chicken in the room is farmed animals. But we'll get to that in a second. 98% of animals raised for human benefit are excluded from the Animal Welfare Act. A couple 100 million pets, research animals, exhibited animals, not that common. You've got lots of rats and mice and birds, but a whole lot of farmed animals, 9.2 billion. So how are they excluded? They're excluded in two ways. We can go through this pretty quickly. I'm sure most of you are very familiar. But there's, in a sense, two different ways in which they're excluded. First, there's only a limited set of use categories for animals under the Animal Welfare Act. As we mentioned, research, exhibition, and pets. And those categories don't include farmed animals. But then secondarily, farmed animals are explicitly excluded from the definition of the word animal. Okay, so how was their exclusion rationalized? How did this happen? It's called the Animal Welfare Act, so why are 98% of animals that we interact with and we've raised for our benefit, why are they not in the Act? For those who don't know the history of the AWA, in 1966, it was originally the Laboratory Animal Welfare Act, the LAWA. In 1970, it's renamed, and the initial bill in 1970 is offered up that would amend the language and expand the definition of animal to be any warm-blooded animal. That would, of course, include farmed animals. Of course, there'd still be the limited use cases, so we'd be talking here about research farm animals, but they would have been included initially. However, that was rejected for a variety of reasons. Taking a step back, because it was originally the Laboratory Animal Welfare Act, even though the name was changed, in a sense, there was no rationalization for excluding these 9 billion, less back then, farmed animals, because even though the name had changed, it was still, in essence, the Laboratory Animal Welfare Act. But I think there were also some implicit reasons or rationalizations going on for their exclusion. First of all, in the backs of the heads of the legislators and of the lobbyists that are present in 1970, it is the Laboratory Animal Welfare Act in their minds. But there's two other items as well. One, it's just too costly. This is an argument you're going to hear again and again and again when you look at farmed animal welfare. And also, it's unnecessary. Now, I'm not saying it was, in fact, unnecessary, but I'm saying that was the argument being made. So, talking about cost, the American Society of Animal Science, at the Animal Welfare Act congressional hearing in June 8th, 1970, among other things, said a climate must prevail, permitting the maximum research output per dollar of public funds expended. So they argued, in essence, that there had to be no hindrance, no burdens put on research if the Animal Welfare Act were to be successful. But to the final point on this slide, unnecessary. We'll talk about factory farming in a second and make sure we're on the same page about what it actually is. But in 1970, while industrialized farm animal production had already begun in earnest, it was still relative to today in its infancy, much less developed than it is today. Okay, so what's a factory farm? It's a very politicized term. There's different definitions. You could use concentrated animal feed operation, which has a statutory definition behind it. Industrialized farm animal production would be the Pew Research Institute definition. To me, there are 2 or 3 factors that come into play when you talk about factory farming. The first is obviously the environment. Cramped, intensive, right? The feed is brought to the animals instead of them being able to forage. They're limited in their range of naturalistic behaviors that they're actually able to express. I'll grab some water. And generally not able to act like they would want to as animals. A second point, though, is genetics. This is one that is especially a problem for poultry. Yeah, so over 9 billion animals are raised on factory farms every year. So the vast majority of animals excluded from the AWA are in fact farmed animals and in fact on factory farms. So we don't want to gross you out too much with details, right? We could show you all the videos in the world. Most of you guys have probably already seen them. They're not fun conversations to have with your friends and family over a meal, especially over Thanksgiving. But these are the realities that these animals face, and there are a lot of them. Meat chickens or broilers growing so obese so quickly that up to 1/3 of them can't walk correctly, can't breathe correctly. They're eating constantly because that's the way we've bred them. They don't really have an upper limit on their appetite, which means even though they are obese, they're probably constantly very hungry. That's probably even more so the case for the parent and grandparent birds of those broilers, because they actually had to be feed restricted so that they don't become too obese to lay the eggs that become the birds we eat. So again, we could go on and on talking about the problems of factory farming. The US has among the weakest farm animal welfare standards in the developed world. So here, this is from World Animal Protection. This is the countries that rank as a D on their map. And countries that rank a C include China, India, Brazil, Argentina. We in Canada are really the only few of the Western countries that are ranked that poorly. Okay, so we've got a pretty grim problem, right? We've had a lot of bad news, I feel like, the past couple of panels. What do we do? 99% of farm animals are factory farmed, and they represent the vast majority of all animals that we raise for our benefit in the United States and in the world. Is there any hope? And how does the AWA factor into this, if at all? There is hope. The tide is turning. My nonprofit, Farm Forward, I've worked there 5 years. It's started about 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, pigs elicited some concern. Cows got some compassion. Chickens and turkeys, not as much. In just the past decade, organizations like mine, like ASPCA and HSUS, has seen a sea change in compassion, not just for the cuddliest of the farmed animals, but for those that are a little bit more alien to us, those that aren't as like us. Consumer values are changing. Consumer Reports found in 2015 that 84% of consumers say that better living conditions for farmed animals are important or very important. 2014 survey found that 69% of respondents said that animal welfare is a significant factor when they go grocery shopping. The organics market is booming. You see the graph in the lower left. And organic has not actually been associated with higher welfare, but what's funny is that most consumers think that it is. And so you can use that, in fact, as a proxy to show the growth of concern for farmed animal welfare, even when, in fact, the organic eggs are not typically associated with higher welfare. Consumers are becoming much more aware of the key co-benefits that go along with mitigation of factory farming. Issues like superbugs, other food safety issues, even issues that are not necessarily that associated, like GMO or genetically engineered. These are terms that consumers throw around, and even though we don't use them because it's not really the correct language for chickens and turkeys, those fears still play into their desire to move away from factory farming. Of course, we have more and more companies committing themselves to better welfare policies. Walmart, Kroger, Kraft, Safeway, many others just in 2016 committing to going cage-free with their eggs. You've got lots of state-level reforms, and that's really where a lot of the movement has been in the past 10 years. Yes on 3, for example. And then, of course, there are the ag laws that I think to most of us just look desperate. And while we should take them seriously, they also are a sign that the industry knows things are changing and that they're very afraid. Okay, so these are all these reasons why we can have some courage. We can take some heart that things are improving. But how does this relate to the Animal Welfare Act? Can we actually translate any of this energy, any of this excitement, any of this change into federal change, whether it's via the AWA or a different vehicle? In the long term, I think the answer has to be yes. Ethics drive law. And our ethics have changed radically since 1970, when farmed animal welfare wasn't as much on the radar, when factory farming wasn't near as egregious and upsetting as it is now. So in the long term, I think the answer has to be yes. I don't think we'll get state-level reforms at every state that would do as good of a job, potentially, as federal changes may. In the short term, it's harder to say, right? Insert obligatory Trump statement now. We could talk about the AWARE Act, the Animal Welfare and Agricultural Research Endeavors Act in early 2015. Probably we'll have Jim talking about that more at some point. Put out in the midst of an uproar over not all farmed animals, just farmed animals used for agricultural research on federal facilities, right? A much smaller targeted bill put out in the wake of a scandal from 2015 that was the New York Times expose. It's got a 1% chance of passing, according to GovTrack. That's tough, right? And I'm proposing something much bigger and more radical, which is trying to protect all farmed animals at the federal level. So this is tough. What can we do in the short term, the medium term, that's not federal legislation that can actually encourage those changes in the long term? I think one of the biggest opportunities here is third-party welfare certifications. If you guys aren't familiar, please get familiar. This is where we can make a difference. As individual consumers, every time you buy a certified product, if you are someone who eats animal products, you are voting with those dollars that you actually want a higher welfare product. Global Animal Partnership with their 5-step program, Animal Welfare Approved, it's Certified Humane, some of the best programs out there. They're a small percentage of the market now, but they're growing, and an increasing number of companies are committing voluntarily to using their standards. And institutional buyers are as well. We've been working with a few universities, and they're excited. They actually want to get on board. It's not always this oppositional thing, but in fact, they need education. They need to know where they can actually find these supply chains. We were sort of shocked. That was this big lesson we learned when we started talking to the University of California. And it wasn't that they hated the idea of higher welfare. They embraced it. And they said, help us. We don't know where to get these animals. Do they exist? And the answer was sort of. Let's help build the supply chain. Let's actually try to find higher welfare options for you. And then one other point to make, food label clarification. Okay, so this is just kind of funny. I'll end on this. Millennials. I know you're out there. This is very important. Clearly, we're going to take over. Things are going to go very well for us. 81 million right now. There'll be more of us soon, I'm sure, as we transition from fur babies to actual babies, right? But there's a problem. We're zealous, we're ignorant, and we're numerous. Well, the numerous thing is good, actually, but zealous is good too, but the ignorant thing is the issue. I mentioned earlier, organic products. Most consumers think that they are higher welfare. They're not. There is a proposed rule that would actually make that change, but my point is, okay, 77% of millennials say they're either well-informed or know quite a bit about organic products. 60% say they have a strong connection to organic, but again, almost all consumers, and that includes millennials, are misinformed about what organic means. In other words, they're very excited about making a change, but they're buying the wrong products. So what does this mean? Well, we see in this room some millennials who are also lawyers in training. I've been working for Farm Forward for 5 years, and the most zealous people that care about farm animal welfare call in or email us and say, I'm excited about this third-party certification, but they haven't read the regulations. They don't really know all the rules behind them. It's very complex stuff. We need people with sharp legal minds. Tell your millennial friends who aren't as smart as you, who aren't attorneys. Just one example, and I'll stop, because I know I'm past time. Sorry. This is I snapped this picture recently in Whole Foods. Just look at all the terms here that are totally unregulated. We have an arms race going on between third-party certifiers who are trying to make a difference to improve farmed animals, and just some marketing that got approved somehow. It's thoughtfully raised, guys. This is a thoughtfully raised turkey. What does that mean? It means nothing. This is what we're fighting. The industry knows this is the way to market, but they're not willing to actually make the commitment to change. So what does this mean? It means we need people that are committed, if they're buying animal products, to work on buying third-party certified products. The goal being in the long term that these can actually be a sort of de facto regulation. Ethics drive law. And the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Our ethics have changed since 1970. Our law should as well. Thank you so much.
So our next speaker is Sue Leary.
Hi, everyone. Yay for staying. Actually, I said to David, how are we going to get everybody to wake up? And he said, well, I thought you know show tunes. And he was right. So now that I've scared you, maybe you're more awake. So I feel a little bit preaching to the choir here. I would think that most people who have an interest in this issue are aware that birds, rats, and mice bred for use in research, which is an important point, are not covered by the Animal Welfare Act. And there was a story there, and today I'm here to tell the story. Sad but true. So I'm with an organization called the Alternatives Research and Development Foundation. We're associated with the American Anti-Vivisection Society, And here's what we do. Oh, my timer's moving, isn't that wonderful? Okay. So we were founded to support the development, validation, adoption of non-animal methods. So we have an alternatives research program. We've given over $3 million in grants to develop alternative methods. We also look at sponsoring scientific meetings. There are a number of you who may be familiar with the World Congress on Alternatives in Animal Use in the Life Sciences, including Alan Goldberg, who ran the first one. Yay, Alan. And we provide an award of recognition for people who have made significant contributions to the field of alternatives with the William and Eleanor Cave Award. And we do engage in science policy regarding alternatives. So that's where we were coming from when, in 1998, we got involved in all this. So today I just want to go over some of the key events, the issues, what's going on here. Are we really making some science-based decisions or politics? And some recommendations. And this is all basically coming from an article we put together in 2011 for a poster at one of the World Congresses. And I thank my co-authors, Crystal Schaefer and Vicki Kutrinik, who worked at the American AV Society. So 1970, AWA expanded. You can see our little timeline here, the amendments that we were excited about in 1985. And then a significant case in 1992 by our colleagues at ALDF and HSUS. And they got a very nice decision on the merits of the case that excluding birds, rats, and mice, and I'll spare you the genus Rattus, genus Mus, all that, was arbitrary and capricious and violates the law. Unfortunately, they lost on standing. So that was never applied. However, I should say that there were already murmurings at USDA, some recognition that they came pretty close. And maybe they should start thinking about getting them in there. So in 1998, after a number of years where we had been funding some terrific alternatives to the production of monoclonal antibodies, which is almost entirely in mice, we realized that we had no way to find out if our terrific alternatives were being used because no one's even counting the mice that were being used. And a lot of the alternative methods that were being developed were alternatives to the use of rats or mice, but we had no way to compel people to consider these alternatives because they were excluded from the law. So that was the basis of our interest. So we filed a petition with USDA, and then, frankly, what happened was they did request public comments on the petition, but it was very clear from the way they phrased their request for public comments that they were going to maintain that they actually did have discretion to exclude them. So we didn't wait for a long comment period. We initiated a lawsuit, filed our complaint in 1999. Then, interestingly, one of our co-plaintiffs, some of you know this case, some of you teach it, was a young woman who was a student at a liberal arts college. So this is a college that did not have a research program, so they had no IACUC. But they were using rats in psychology classes. And she personally had to intervene for these animals. She cared for them over the holidays when the professor didn't seem to care at all about what happened to them. And we had been in contact with us because she called the AAVS office and said, can you help me find homes for these rats? So she had taken a lot of personal injury in order to advocate for these animals. And so she actually was granted standing by the judge. As soon as that happened, the USDA, knowing that they lost on the merits of the case before, approached us about settling. So, unfortunately, there were some people upset about that. National Association of Biomedical Research, they filed a motion to intervene. Johns Hopkins filed a motion to intervene, but we did reach a settlement with USDA, and they did agree to initiate rulemaking that would include birds, rats, and mice. Notice 3 days later, there was another motion to intervene that was denied, and then less than a month later, the Agriculture Appropriations Bill prohibited the USDA from enacting the terms of our settlement. So it happened pretty fast. Ending up with the Farm Bill in 2002, when Jesse Helms, who was leaving, it was one of his last times as a senator, he did manage to, without any floor discussion or anything like that, I think it was pretty late at night, did manage to get this amendment into the bill, and they are now formally excluded. But there's the matter of this comma. So I'll explain that later. So here are the key issues that I think are often overlooked when this issue is taught. There was a lot of support in the research community. There's a lot of polarization now, and it's research versus animal people. That wasn't entirely the case. AALI, which is a major organization that accredits laboratories that do animal research, it says conditionally supports, but they recognized, because actually they cover all vertebrates. ALAS at the time, which is American Association Laboratory Animal Science, they supported it. Our friends at the Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing and the Scientist Center for Animal Welfare. We also had company support from Colgate-Palmolive, Procter & Gamble, and there was a survey of, rank and file research people by Plouse and Herzog, and the majority of them did support inclusion of rats and mice. And I think this is often overlooked. It wasn't a monolith of the scientific community. And the other issue that I wanted to emphasize is that this really does have a lot to do with alternatives. We heard earlier that the consideration of alternatives is a part of the law. It's not very well understood, perhaps, by the IACUCs, but it is part of the law. So it is something that we can use as a way to look seriously at what's happening to animals in laboratories. Again, our monoclonal antibody, we see in Europe that it was effective. The other thing is that this is a barrier to harmonization even within US policies. Of course, we had a statement from Senator Dole saying that was not what he had in mind with the 1970 amendments, and so it was against congressional intent. But also, if you look at NIH OLAW's policy, the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, thank you. Again, we were taking an example from Europe to show that it's inconsistent with just about every other standard. And so here's the upshot. The vast majority of animals used in research are not covered by the AWA. And that means that a lot of genetically engineered mice, which are the major category who have major welfare problems, are not included. And we estimate about 95%. I'm not opposed to saying 99%, but we estimate around 95. One of the things we did was look at This is always a question of numbers. How many? Everybody asks how many. Of course, we don't know because they don't count them. That's the problem. But we did extrapolate from some figures from Europe. The European Union collects a tremendous amount of information about the animals being used. So we just, ran a few numbers, and if we assume that similar percentages of birds, rats, and mice, well, I should say all vertebrates, which is really our position right now, used in Europe were used in the US, then we're estimating, so for the most recent European statistics were 2011, about 15 million vertebrates used in the US who are not covered by the Animal Welfare Act. So we're looking at this issue of how did this happen, of course, and I don't think there's any question that it was, obviously a political issue, and it was, there were certain players who were involved, especially and most prominently National Association for Biomedical Research, Johns Hopkins. They had some claims. They were concerned over the ability of the agency to take on this job. We felt that we could work this out in the regulatory process, but they were saying that it was just going to be a disaster. Of course, they've said that before. They felt that current established standards that were voluntary were protecting the animals sufficiently. They were concerned about administrative and economic costs for universities, and of course that's how they got the universities very interested in the issue and lobbying on their behalf. And the quote from Hopkins was they were opposed to any USDA regulation of the use of mice, rats, and birds in research. So they were just blanket opposed. These are the organizations that came out the most strongly. They were identified by an editorial in Nature magazine. In that same editorial, they identified that it was Senator Thad Cochran who did that fast de-appropriations of USDA. And they also went on to say that AALI-Mission, which, as I say, is an association of laboratory animal scientists, called the exclusion ethically indefensible. And they felt that the research lobbyists were giving a false impression that researchers are united in this. And I think this is a key point. And the Nature editorial said that lobbyist arguments verged on the reactionary, and ultimately that research could suffer. So again, I think that when we look forward, we're probably going to be needing the science community to work with us on this, and I think it's very possible. So here's our recommendations. We all know the reasons. I think we're together in this. There are ethical reasons. There's the issue of public accountability, how many animals are being used. This is a lot of taxpayer-funded money. It's a way for us to measure our progress on alternatives. It will harmonize the laws, and it will stimulate the use of alternatives. So here are some ways to do that. We could facilitate scientific and political acceptance by voluntary. We could do a voluntary program. We do need to make sure that animal care has the funding to carry out their duties. And one of our suggestions was to convene a working group. And I do want to thank some of the wonderful people, many of whom are in this room, who helped us in the process of working to defend the settlement that we had, and then working to submit comments on the birds, because that comment that birds who are not bred for use in research are covered by the Animal Welfare Act. And the USDA did invite public comments for that. However, they have not acted on it. So we're pursuing that. But we had a lot of support from all the animal protection organizations. We were very happy for that. And that's pretty much it. That's our little story. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. And batting cleanup for the panel is Kathy Hessler.
Thank you, and I want to add my thanks to our hosts and organizers and all of you for sticking through all this long day of amazing conversation, and all of the people who spoke before us and will speak after us. So it's a great conference. Thank you. So I'm here to talk to you about aquatic animals, and aquatic animals are animals that we don't tend to think about very often. And building off or following a comment earlier in the morning, if we don't see them, we can't really know them. We can't think about them. They are very much the most othered animals that we have right now. And they fit into both of the categories that my colleagues just spoke about, into the farmed animal category and into the research animal category, and all of the categories that are covered and excluded under the Animal Welfare Act. And so I'll talk about that a little bit. So, I'm not going to go very deeply into the coverage issues because we've been talking about that, but this is my quick overview. When we're talking about aquatic animals, there's overlaps between other types of animals we've been talking about a lot today. So some are vertebrates, some are not vertebrates. Some are marine mammals, some are not. Some are warm-blooded, some, right? So we have different kinds of categories. So aquatic animals is a very large category, and these animals are all over the world, right? They're in our streams, our fishes, our lakes, our oceans, but they're in our factories as well. They're in our homes. They're in aquariums. They're all over the place. And they are the least regulated animals. So we have some real significant conversations in thinking about how we treat and use them. And when I talk to people about doing aquatic animal work, people just assume I'm talking about fish. And so that's why I have this list here, right? So fish are on there, but they're just one category of aquatic animals we need to be thinking about. And again, if we don't realize that all of these categories are out there, and all of them, right, fit into food categories and into testing categories and into exhibition categories, then we're not thinking about the kinds of regulations that actually should apply to them and what their needs might be. So that's why we have the list. So we've talked a little bit about what the AWA covers. And so we know the sort of categories for exhibition research for pets in commercial use. And again, I want you to be thinking about the types of activities that it regulates, because the animals I'm talking about don't get any of this, right, under any circumstance, if we're not talking about marine mammals, which was already covered a little bit this morning. So we're not doing any record keeping. We're not worried about their housing. We're not worried about under the Animal Welfare Act. We're just not caring about these animals. And so we need to start thinking about how we care about them. So everyone's very familiar with the definition of animal under the Animal Welfare Act, but I just want to point out that, again, as my colleagues have said, there are different ways of thinking about exclusions under this act, right? So initially, we were talking about laboratory animals, and now Sue has led us really nicely through why and how we got to this exclusion for the birds, the mice, and the rats. And farm animals are their own exclusion, as Michael explained. Aquatic animals aren't on here. They're not even important enough to be excluded, right? They're so far outside of our sphere of understanding or concern that it's so clear to everyone that they're not covered, but we don't even have to say they're not covered. And I want to just point that out. That's the status these animals are in our society, okay? And so part of my job is to lift them up, right? I want everyone to see them, start thinking about them. When we're talking about farmed animals, it's useful to say, additionally, right, we're talking about how many billions of terrestrial farmed animals. Because if we're thinking there's 60 billion terrestrial animals globally, it's somewhere between 100 to 200, 1 to 2 trillion, right, aquatic animals, just in the food industry, okay? So if we think that's 9 terrestrial animals for every human being on the planet eating, it's 150 to 300, right, aquatic animals. So we're talking about a lot of animals, a lot of suffering. So what does the Animal Welfare Act cover? So as we've discussed, marine mammals, so that's cetaceans, whales and dolphins, pinnipeds, seals and sea lions. Just because I need to push the boundaries in everything I do. So warm-blooded animals are covered, right? And so science has taught us since kindergarten that fish aren't warm-blooded, right? That aquatic animals generally aren't. Well, it turns out that salmon, sharks, billfish, some tuna are partially warm-blooded. So one question is that enough? How much warm-bloodedness do we need to have to be covered? Might be an interesting question to push, but just in 2015, this is a picture of an opa. In 2015, this fish was discovered and to be warm-blooded. And so this might be another avenue to sort of crack that ceiling, if you will, and say, all right, if you really mean warm-blooded, then we have a fish for you to consider. We'll see where that goes. Okay, so again, these are the kinds of regulations that don't apply to the animals I'm talking about. And again, we've had lots of conversation about the weaknesses of the Animal Welfare Act, and I'm not here to defend the Animal Welfare Act as being a wonderful model piece of legislation. But it does do some things, and those minimal things aren't being done for aquatic species. And so even as Sue said, right, it would be nice to know the numbers. And if they had to do some record keeping, that would be a place to start. And people would have their eyes opened. And that would eventually help us change some policy. So looking into some of the different categories for a moment. So these are zebrafish. In research, these animals are coming up fast. They're not anywhere near rodents just yet, but they're coming up fast. And when people start thinking about replacing animals, they think about this vertical taxonomy, right? So we don't want to use primates, non-human primates. We don't want to use dogs for all the reasons that you already know, right? So then we use mice. Okay, well, if we don't want to use mice, maybe we're going to use fish, right? And so there's some real important scientific reasons why the researchers are using these models, and we could go into that if you're interested later on. But really, it's partly driven by this value, right, trajectory. And so lower down on the taxonomic scale, we care less, and we think that's okay. And so I'm here to challenge that. But these are zebrafish, so you can see what they like. And part of the reason researchers use them is they can be bred now to be translucent. The juveniles were translucent to begin with, but now adults can be bred translucent, and so it's really useful for researchers to be able to just visibly see the tumors they're inducing in these animals. Okay, so in addition to the Animal Welfare Act, we've talked a little bit today about the Public Health Service policy, and so many of you already know about it. When I talk about animals in research, my scientist friends get annoyed if I don't say, but they are covered, right? The animals that aren't covered under the Animal Welfare Act are covered under the PHS. And I usually say, but not by statutory mandate, and there's no citizens' provision, and I can't enforce it, and all kinds of other reasons, right? But I want to just be really clear about which animals are covered under which rubric. So because the PHS covers vertebrates, the Animal Welfare Act exempt animals that the PHS does cover include fish, amphibians, and reptiles, right? This is a baby zebrafish, in case you weren't familiar with them. I didn't used to be. But we also have categories of animals that are exempt from both the Animal Welfare Act and the PHS. Again, the minimal coverage is not afforded to these animals, even under any circumstance. And these are actually photographs taken from research facilities. So these animals are being used in research. It's not that they're not. So we have some significant, I think, ethical conversations when we're talking about what we do with the animals in research. So there is this fundamental irony that we think we're going to get enough value from the researching on animals to benefit the human population, which means we have made some statement that they're close enough to us genetically, right, to get this valid data, and yet they're not close enough to us ethically to treat them the way that we would treat humans in research context. And I think that's an irony that needs more discussion. The idea of using animals further and further down the taxonomy, I think, creates another problem in addition to just an ethical one, and that is it delays the real full development of alternatives. We just need to move to alternatives, right? We have tissue culturing. We can get straight to human tissue cells. We've got computational biology. We have informatics. We have all kinds of alternatives, and we should be getting to them because it's faster, it's cheaper, and it's more actually predictive. We're getting better data. We have the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness that has been referenced, saying animals have consciousness, which categories. We have so many of these animals being used. We need to deal with the fact that the 3 Rs are not, in fact, required. And we have a lot we can learn from scientific, the science elsewhere. So I think other places, Europe and England in particular, are doing a much better job looking at these and sort of developing regulatory models that incorporate the actual and evolving science. And we can talk about those more later. So we also have, this is the conditions in which some of these animals are used, raised, held in research. The veterinary difficulties when we're starting to talk about aquatic animals is multiplied over what we're talking for terrestrial animals because we don't have enough veterinarians who are trained in the different physiology of these kinds of animals, and that's a really significant problem in thinking about developing regulations. Okay, so a couple of other categories really quickly. Exhibition, so aquatic animals are in exhibition. Millions are taken from the wild for exhibition. The breeding programs obviously are problematic. We have in the United States alone over 115 reputable, I did put that in quotes, aquariums in the United States, and we have real significant issues about how they're managed and when there are problems, the fact that we're not really doing much about them. Pet trade breeding is much larger than I had realized when I started doing this work. The numbers are significant. So 95.5 million freshwater fish, and these are just finned fish, right? This is not all aquatic animals. So different categories for the reptiles, saltwater fish, and that's a relatively recent statistic. So lots and lots of money being spent. 13% of US homes keep fish, and the estimate is that they're refreshing those animals. They die at a rate of about 2.3 times a year, right? So each home is continuing this cycle. 480 million goldfish sold annually in the US. Unbelievable, unbelievable numbers. 250 bred in the US alone, right? Huge, huge issues, and not just goldfish. I won't go into this because I'm running low on time, but cyanide used to get exotic fish from the coral reefs. We can talk about that later if folks are interested. We have significant transportation issues. Again, this should be covered under the AWA for our animals. Really significant conditions. We actually have studies out of the UK about the stress and the harm caused to aquatic species during transportation that the US is ignoring. So what do we do about it? So we can amend the AWA. This is a conversation that our community has had for a really long time. The previous panel has sort of talked about it. That's one option. So we could actually bring the aquatic animals in. We could start looking at the veterinary and scientific information. We could do petitions, or we could develop an entirely new framework. We could say, no, the AWA is either broken enough that we don't want to use it, or it's just too narrow for aquatic species, and we could come up with another framework. We could also look at the state levels, and we could start banning really specific activities, certain kinds of exhibition, which is already happening, certain kinds of transport, certain kinds of breeding. Again, that's happening in for some of the other animals. Actually relatively easy to do theoretically. Politically, another question. So the challenges, right? So federal preemption, if we want to start doing this, there's a case from the Ninth Circuit that was just decided. There are actually a trio of 3 cases out of Hawaii. So there's both good and bad out of this particular case, saying if the USDA no longer regulates a plant, and which they have the ability to regulate biotechnology that's harmful for plants or pesticides, and if they no longer regulate it, states and local counties can. So for those places trying to adopt the GMO bans, right, and there are a number of them in the country, they can withstand scrutiny and preemption and this is really interesting irony, right? So if the USDA has already said it's cool, we've approved this, we don't need to regulate it because it's not harmful, then you can ban it. Okay? Pretty cool. If they are done regulating it, then thorough preemption applies. So another challenge, obviously, we already had a dysfunctional Congress. That was on this slide already like a month and a half ago. And we have State House challenges now. I added to the slide our new president-elect. So he's not interested in regulation. He's, in fact, interested in deregulation. He has friends and supporters in animal use industries, and he's not a fan of science. So that's not helpful for us. So what can we do despite those challenges? So we have some consumer awareness campaigns. We have a lot to do with respect to aquatic animals, in particular about education. People just don't know, and so there's a lot that we can do there. Venture capital for alternatives is really thriving in some of the other areas for terrestrial animals, so we can do that here as well. We've already talked about TSCA. The UK and EU models, I think talking about building into our legislation, sort of when we're talking about science, we should be revisiting these rules every 5 years or something, just like the European conventions do. I'm out of time, so there's more that we can talk about, but I will just leave this slide up. So this is us, the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative at Lewis and Clark. This is our mission statement. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm sure there's a great deal of questions out there, and I want to encourage you to write them down and bring them up. I want to start with just a couple of questions for the panel. One is I want to both seize on Kathy's penultimate slide and also a phrase that Michael used to begin to describe millennials. He talked about zealous, ignorant, and numerous. And I don't know what about that makes me think of that crazy orange-haired vixen we just elected. But I'm wondering if in the age of Trump, what we can say about excluded animals from in the legal and regulatory matrix. And I wonder if the panelists might comment on that.
Well, I can start. One of the things that I think, and you've kind of put the two things together nicely. I think when people in communities that are not our communities find out there's no federal regulation for farmed animals, they're shocked, right? They think we live in a heavily regulated society, and they're just shocked. They don't know that information. When they realize that 95% to 98% of the animals we use in testing aren't regulated by the federal statute, they're shocked, and they're appalled usually. And when they realize that their food is not being protected in the way they think because it's being grown in really horrific conditions. So I think there's this education gap, which I think exists in our president-elect. And so I think if he can be educated that there are things that are going to harm his reputation, his business interests, right? The things he cares about, that's a way to reach him. It has to come, I think, from people he respects, which would not be me. So people in his community, people that he trusts. And so if we can find people we know who, can get his ear, who he trusts, I do think he's malleable, right? He shows that he changes his mind all the time. And so I think if we attach it to an interest that he cares about, coming from a place where he trusts and filling in that education gap, I think there's a chance. That's when I'm on my hopeful days, which I'll stay with right now.
Well, when I invoked millennials, I think I'm at some level guilty of doing that thing that all of us are now looking back at the election and thinking we did, which was we sort of think of our group, right, our millennials. And so I tend to think of every millennial as being the liberal hipster that cares deeply about farmed animals. That's not all liberals. So we have, or all millennials. So we have this division even amongst that age group. I grew up in South Carolina, and when I go back to my home, where I was raised to think that animal rights was a dirty phrase, environmentalism was a four-letter word. I see signs of hope amongst my friends who are still living there. I don't see hope on the major political issues not related to animals, but there's this sort of nascent I think foodieism ends up being this thing that hasn't been politically divisive, and that's coming into the young people I know. Even if they're conservative, they still care about craft beer. It sounds strange, but that wasn't a culture that existed where I grew up even 10 years ago. So I think there's opportunities here to bridge some of these divides with young people, because I don't think there's been so much shouting and so much divisiveness around the election. There hasn't been enough air in the room to make animals a divisive issue like they used to be, if that makes any sense. And so my friends back home are more quizzical about farmed animals and animal welfare than they are oppositional, which presents an opportunity. So in other words, I think there isn't a fissure along this line for us like there was for people my age 10 or 20 years ago, interestingly enough.
Well, I'm not a Washington person. I'm just like everybody else thinking there's probably not a big chance of amending the Animal Welfare Act to include excluded animals in the next few years. But one of the things that I was mentioning was the building consensus piece of this, and that's going to take a long time. That's going to be a long process anyway. I don't see Bruce here now, but I'm sure he would agree that the TSCA reform didn't happen by itself. One of the reasons the TSCA reform happened was because there was really strong consensus in the science community that toxicity testing needed to go in a new direction. That came out of a 2007 report by the National Academies of Sciences called Toxicity Testing in the 21st Century. So these things are very long processes, and I don't think there's any harm in trying to go for the consensus building piece of this now. I think it's probably a little too neat a summary to just say the new crew is anti-science. Certainly there are some things in science that have been very politicized, and I think that's a political decision more than anything. I do think that if there were scientific consensus, that it makes sense to arrange, research policy and science policy in a certain way. It could move forward.
Okay, and now I'm going to just follow in the illustrious footsteps of David Faber as using the moderator's chair as the agent provocateur. So let me just hey, you did it. And so, Michael, you said something very intriguing. You talked about how you see, among other things, ag-gag laws as a sort of a hopeful sign because it shows that the industry knows that it's in trouble, and that but what it also, one could view it as, a very repressive set of laws, right? So so would you also then, for example, look at the AWA amendments that exclude birds, rats, and mice as a sign of hope? And then, Mike, I would broaden that question to Sue to ask if you agree with that, if so. And my question for Kathy, jumping from there, is given the lack of any law at all protecting marine animals, would you see some bad law or failed litigation as a hopeful sign?
So I follow your logic. It's interesting, coming to the Animal Welfare Act, what I see, at least from a farmed animal welfare perspective, is an old, miserable state of affairs. And so when I see the exclusions for rats, mice, and birds, I'm not seeing that as a hopeful thing. I'm seeing it as a problem that has existed and, of course, is federal. And so, as we have all the problems. I mean, the whole reason we're having this panel is because it's so difficult to struggle with figuring out how we're going to make these changes. So, no, I'm not hopeful when I see that. On the ag-gag side, this is state by state. Many have been defeated, and many have just been written so egregiously and broadly that they set themselves up to be defeated. So, in terms of ag-gag being a sign of hope, it's just sort of a conversation that I think has been going on in the activist community a little bit, that it's seen as such an overreach, that that when you mention ag-gag laws, and for those who aren't aware, right, ag-gag laws are just restrictions on any kind of undercover filming of agricultural facilities for these exposés that are so powerful for activists. But that it's such an overreach that when you mention ag-gag to almost anyone who's not sort of already stopped their ears to hearing about the plight of farmed animals, they're livid. Like you said a moment ago, right? A lot of people just assume that farmed animals are being regulated and are fairly happy, and there's lots of laws surrounding them. So I think that's what I mean when I say there's a cause for hope, is that it's had a reverse effect in some ways, with consumers getting more animated on the issue because of the overreach.
So if I understood the question correctly, I would say no, I did not consider the Helms Amendment to be a good sign. I think I'm sure about that. But I do think, I mean, what it was a lobbying group exercising political muscle. They had their nose out of joint because they'd been shut out, they felt, and they were like, oh yeah. I mean, basically that's what happened. So we're a little bit back to the drawing board, but I do think that scientific consensus can be built around this. It is ridiculous to say that rats and mice are not animals, and birds are not animals, and fish are not animals. They are animals, clearly. And there's a great deal of hope, actually, on the alternative side. I just went, there's a great database of alternative methods that's operated and maintained by the European Union called DBALM. It's small d, small b, and then capital ALM. And I just looked there the other day, and there are 336 alternative methods listed. So it's happening. It's growing. And here at Harvard, the on-a-chip technologies they have tremendous interest from the pharmaceutical industry. So I think that there has been a real opening of this field because of the alternative methods, because they represent better science and interesting and new biology, and take advantage of technology and answer questions we couldn't answer, questions we couldn't answer before. So I think that the positive signs are there, but it's not because of the amendment.
And I guess, so I would put each of these sets of animals in sort of different categories. And I take your prompt, David, to sort of highlight the fact that aquatic animals are in a vacuum, right? So it's almost like there isn't anyone even talking about them, so it's hard to know how to take that, except obviously I take that poorly. But thinking about the trajectory for each of these categories of animals, so the mice and rats were already the highest numbers, and they were already excluded, even when on the face of the statute they shouldn't have been, right? So that was happening just pro forma, right? And then when it was challenged, they made it formal. And I think thinking about that trajectory, I do think it's an arc, and I do think it's going to be ending. And I think with the undercover stuff, the impact it was having on society, the undercover in the farmed animal context, the ag industry just tried to shut it down, right? They just said, first we're going to ignore it, we're going to then say it's all lies, and then when we can't sort of ignore it anymore, we're just going to try and make it go away. Without actually thinking about, and I read a lot of ag newsletters, about thinking about what that was going to look like to the public. So there's much more backlash about, well, what are you trying to hide than there is in the scientific community, because there isn't that much information coming out. And I think so the aquatic animals there's really no information coming out, but there is a lot of information. So there are hundreds of studies now on sentience for fish or different aquatic species. And we're not talking about just they can feel pain, right? People have now accepted, scientists have generally accepted they can feel pain. We're talking about, family aware of time, using tools, right? Machiavelli Smithsonian level planning and, I mean, really amazing stories. We, in a class that I teach, sometimes we talk about an animal and tell a story about the animal did this and this and this, and then, the abusive boyfriend killed the animal and what should be the recovery. And then we tell them that the animal was a goldfish. And they're stunned because they don't think that a goldfish has any of those capacities because of the way we're trained to think about these animals. And so when we understand their capacities, we can think very differently about them. So I think that's the pathway forward first before really even legislation or litigation for aquatic animals. I think fighting the repressive laws, I agree with Michael that it is a recognition in the ag industry that they were losing this fight. And so it's a desperate sort of effort. And we're actually winning the ag fight now, which makes me a little bit more hopeful. Who knows what will happen, right? I'm done making predictions about anything for a while. So I think all of these pieces come together, right? There's no linear path for each of the groups of animals, but comparing them is useful because we do learn from the strategies from each of the different sets of campaigns.
Okay, here's a question for all the panelists from the audience. What are the panelists' thoughts on the practicality of expanding the federal law? The practicality to include things like expense and governmental burden. And what about other possible methods, for example, accreditation or local laws, as we see in the city of Cambridge, for example?
I'll jump in and say, in terms of, I'm less familiar with local laws. In terms of state laws, that's where there really has been the most progress in the past 15 years. I don't think that should preclude looking for changes on the federal level. But instead employing a both-and strategy, because I think they're both important. As to the practicality, as to the expense, as to what specifically those changes would look like on the federal level, I'd be interested if you guys agree. But when you're receiving no protections at all, I wouldn't be that picky. I mean, sure, we could craft great legislation, but at this point, anything would be a starting point. Anything would be better than what exists right now. So it's not a question I've looked at as closely, but it'd be an exciting place to be if we could actually craft that legislation at the federal level.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
So I think that I agree with that. If we could get some even numbers for aquatic animals, right? If we get some records, if we could get, like, theoretically, that would help enormously. I think coming back to David Favor's sort of ship analogy, listing ship, I think the pragmatic impact, because we're talking about if we had farmed animals and aquatic animals, right now we're actually adding all the animals, and that's like throwing dynamite on that ship, right, and blowing it up, because it just won't work. Already the system, right, the enforcement, the number of inspectors, all of it, right, it just doesn't work the way it should already. And if we add in all these animals, I think it may make clear sort of the lie, right, that is this act. But I don't know what impact it would have for the few animals it does help, and so I would want to think carefully about it. Yeah.
That sort of leads to, there was a second issue that the questioner raised that also goes to another question here that's directed at Michael, and that's the issue of accreditation. So what in general do you folks think about third-party accreditation? Now, clearly Michael is in favor of them. Did the other panelists share that view? And the question, the audience question for you, Michael, just to follow up on that, is what is the level of enforcement for certified humane farms? And if you wanted to take that to other certification methods as well, I'm sure people would be interested to hear that.
So we start with the first question and then I'll follow up?
Yes.
Or?
Yes.
What do you guys think about certification?
I am so
What
lost.
are your thoughts
Sorry,
on?
it's my fault. What are your thoughts on third-party accreditation?
Well, that's funny because as soon as you started to say that, one of the programs I'm involved with is accreditation of, well, not accreditation, certification of companies that do not test on animals, that are cosmetics companies. And I'm also on the board of Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, which credits sanctuaries. So I have a little experience with accrediting systems. They're very different depending on the field, but all of them require site visits and and audits and examinations of your records. And I mean, it can certainly be done. I mean, I don't know what the criteria would be for animals raised for food, but it can certainly be done.
And I agree that in different situations, it's sort of a different set of conversations. I would say sort of at the outset, it depends on what your goals are. And so if your goal, for instance, would be no more animals used as food, then accreditation may actually set you back a little bit in that, sort of helping the population think these animals are really well treated and that it's okay to continue to engage in that activity without thinking about some of the other consequences in addition to the welfare consequences. But if that's not your goal, and your goal is incremental improvement of animal welfare, then yeah, absolutely, right? We have to have other voices that are credible voices to counter the narrative that we get either from the government or the industry. So again, it just depends on what your goals are. And so I think if our third-party accreditation is really for the complete alternatives, right? If we're talking about non-animal food and products that are not tested on animals, then that's sort of a better use, I think, of third-party accreditation systems because it achieves more goals all at the same time.
So to your follow-up, my thoughts on enforcement, I'll take that a little more broadly just to say not all third-party farmed animal welfare certification systems are created equal. There were a few that I mentioned specifically. There were a few that I didn't, and that are not very robust. Either their standards aren't very strong or very different from industry norms, or they're not enforced very well. And so that's almost a sort of a different example of the same thing I mentioned there with the turkey, where you have a producer making claims that are either misleading or they are totally unregulated. That there's an issue with the third-party certifications as well, that you sort of have this whirlwind of new labels that have come onto the market in the past 5 or 10 years, and they can sometimes obfuscate rather than illuminate what's really going on with the animals. That's why I was sort of making that point there at the end, that we really need to take time to figure out what these standards mean. They're not simple. They're sometimes 10, 20, 30 pages of detailed rules, but some are better than others, some are enforced better than others, and I think we need to, as consumers, commit to having a higher degree of interest in investing time in figuring out what they mean. So the enforcement isn't perfect, even with the better programs, and so there's always that potential for conflicts of interest, or simply for, if you're a third-party certification and then your farm has a scandal or has a problem, one instinct might be to cover it up rather than to be honest. And so that's going to be an issue that can never be totally fixed, but is, I think, in some ways a growing pain that some of these organizations are having to work through. So that's a long way of saying it's a good solution, but it's not perfect.
Okay, well, because we're the last panel of the day and because there's only 1 minute left, we're going to forego the lightning round. And instead, I'll ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful session.